a brief visualization practice so we can all experience compassion together. So if you could find a nice grounded position, feeling your feet on the ground and your seat on your chair, and finding the stability of your spine and stillness. You can close your eyes or cast your gaze down and focusing your eyes. And let's take a few deep cleansing breaths to start. So exhaling everything out. Inhaling through the nose, filling the lungs to capacity. And exhaling out of the mouth, letting it all go. Let's do that 2 more times. Big, deep inhale. And exhale. And again, inhaling. Exhaling. And keeping the eyes closed and closing the lips and just breathing in and out of the nostrils. And I invite you to think back about a time that you experienced compassion. So a time when either you were suffering and someone helped you, or maybe a time when you noticed someone suffering and you helped them, or perhaps a time when you witnessed compassion happening in front of you. And see if you can put yourself back in that moment with as much detail as possible, noticing where you are, what was happening and who was there, what you hear and see. And now tuning into the body and noticing what you feel. What sensations can you notice as you're giving, receiving, or witnessing compassion? Asking yourself, what does compassion feel like? And now bringing your attention again to the breath, noticing the breath in and the breath out, and opening the eyes. And my hope is, we don't have time to talk about what you felt because we have to go, but my hope is that what you noticed was warmth. And you could feel this warm feeling in the heart and also perhaps throughout the whole body. It's a very long story short. Burrell and I wanted to give a quick introduction of who we are and where we're coming from. We do this work because of that warm feeling that you felt. We think that our world and our society needs more of that. And long story short, our organization started many years ago when the word compassionate in my mind appeared as 2 words, compassionate. And I thought, hey, that's pretty clever. It's like, just do it or Google it. This makes compassion a verb. And I started making stickers and that turned into t-shirts, and that soon turned into these reversible wristbands that you flip every time you do an act of compassion. That turned it into a global movement, and we have wristbands all over the world prompting compassionate actions, from villages in Liberia to homes in Nepal to teens in Argentina. And we've been teaching compassion since 2012. I found out that Stanford has a Center for Compassion and Altruism. They had developed an 8-week course to help people cultivate compassion for themselves and others. They were looking for teachers, and I was lucky enough to be in the first cohort to get trained to teach that. And then Burrell was in the second. So Burrell, I'm going to turn it over to you so you can quickly introduce yourself.
Yes, so I met Sara back in 2012 as a part of an online social entrepreneurship course. I was a year out of the military and I returned home to the west side of Chicago to discover that I would have been safer, literally deployed on the battlefield than I was moving back home to the neighborhood that I'm from. And I found that unconscionable. So I was seeking out what are some ways that I can make an impact in the community, and I just thought that social entrepreneurship was one. And Sara brought up this idea of turning compassionate into two words, right? Compassionate. Right? How do we inspire compassionate actions? And it started with the wristband and wearing it with the intention of doing something compassionate every day. And when I looked around me, I'm like, well, a wristband ain't gonna fix what's going on here in Chicago. That's absurd. But as I began to go out into the world, practice intention more, learned more about compassion at the Stanford Institute, I began to see that like that warm glow collectively has an enormous amount of power. Not just myself, but when other people are harnessing the power of that warm glow, we can make a huge difference in the world. So at Stanford, we learned about more about what compassion is, and simply put, the recognition of suffering, feeling the need to help, and having the willingness to act. So many of our problems in the world stem from people not recognizing other suffering, not feeling like it's their problem too, and not wanting to do anything about it. And that's something that needs to change.
And in fact, Stanford has defined it as a cascade of events that begins first with noticing that suffering is happening, which is why mindfulness is a big part of compassion. If you're not present, you can't witness suffering. I can't tell that you need my help if I don't see you, or if I have my head buried in my phone. I also can't tell that I'm suffering if I'm not present. So first you notice the suffering, then you feel empathy, which can happen automatically because of mirror neurons in our brains that allow us to feel what another feels. Or you can use your imagination and say, I can try to put myself in your shoes and feel what you're experiencing. Then this desire from within bubbles up, this desire to help. And then with compassion, there's this willingness to act, to do something about it. That's how compassion and empathy are different. Empathy means, sure, I can feel what you're feeling, but with compassion, there's this willingness to do something. And then compassion should feel good. You should have that warm glow. It's something that is energizing. You never get tired of it. It's self-sustaining. There's really no such thing as compassion fatigue. It's empathy fatigue. Okay, go ahead, Burrell.
So, one thing that we like to talk about at Compassionate is that there's a difference between how compassion is experienced individually and how do we turn compassion into action at a collective scale. So individually, it feels good. It creates connection. It promotes healing. I can probably talk to 100 people from anywhere around the world, from any political background, any geographical location, and ask them how important is compassion for them personally and connecting to the people around you. And then you'd probably say, yeah, like this is something that's amazing. But we don't harness that energy collectively. And collectively, if we harness the energy of compassion, we can change the world. So systemic compassion requires us to look at two things. One, we don't want to cause suffering, right? So a compassionate institution works very hard to alleviate suffering and not cause harm. So if there's something in our actions that we're doing that causes harm, that's a problem. We don't want to hurt people in the process of us doing business. But second, healing suffering. We want to actively go out and try to alleviate the suffering. So my mission, no matter what my institution is, no matter what our organization's goals are and operations are, we're trying to help people, and we're actively figuring out how do we heal suffering from those who are connected to our missions in any way.
And since today Burrell and I were thinking that really there are a couple main points that education systems need to think about. And one is is, I believe, Bob, you said this earlier, which is our schools need to teach compassion. This should be something that's a part of everyday school, starting in kindergarten. This should be part of the vocabulary. Instead of an anti-bullying program, it should be pro-compassion. I mean, this needs to happen. This is vital to creating systemic compassion. And then secondly, we need institutions to look at the educational institution themselves to figure out how are they behaving, and are they acting compassionately? Are they trying to heal individuals, and are they non-harming? And we're out of time, so we kept this short so that we could answer your questions. And I know it was just scratching the surface of compassion, and so many of you are already know a lot about compassion. So we're really looking forward to your questions. And I'm sorry if you heard my dog crying in the background, but he really wants to go outside right now, of course.
Well, I mean, just like seeing myself with the haircut, that's part of COVID. That's part of our experience, and everyone being at home. So
Yeah.
Norman is welcome.
Burrell and Sara, thanks for sharing your work. I wonder, I love your idea of kind of both molding compassionate students. And my role as an educator is focused predominantly on high school students, but I'm in a K through 12 community. So we see our successes and failures in that regularly. And I guess the second part is a little more abstract to me, the idea of developing compassion institutions. And I think so often as educators, we have great silos, and we can teach compassion in our advisory programs. I can teach compassion in my senior ethics elective. But I wonder what you guys might recommend in terms of actually making it part of a systemic culture.
Sure. So I would initially say that, especially in education, self-compassion has to be a priority, that the administrators make sure that their staff and educators know, we care about you and we want you to be able to take care of yourselves. So I think embedding compassion into meetings that you're having, right? Check-ins, making sure people know how everyone's feeling. I mean, Burrell and I lead trainings for organizations and schools often, and a big part of it is helping people understand what is self-compassion, what is compassion, what can we do to support each other as educators and within this system. So unfortunately, it's not something that we actually can prescribe, but we do help inspire those conversations. And a lot of it really comes with people feeling like they can be vulnerable with each other and they can lean on each other for support, right? So you're not feeling like, gosh, I need a day off. I'm really, my principal is going to give me such a hard time if I take a personal day, or my team's going to be let down, right? It's letting people know that they can take care of themselves and can take care of each other. And Burrell, go ahead, and I know you have something to add.
Yeah, in one of the things in coming to understand compassion as an interpersonal skill is really trying to figure out how to infuse it within an organization's culture. And ultimately what practicing compassion is, and what we're really trying to get people to do at Compassion, is change their relationship to suffering. We have an unhealthy relationship with suffering in our society in so many different ways, in that we hide it, we don't talk about it, right? And when we do talk about it, we talk about it in the most unhealthy way. We talk about, our suffering when there's something that we can't do about it. We always talk about it in the abstract, as if it's something that, well, we can't do anything about it. But developing a compassionate culture within an institution such as the school might simply be something that's, when we're having a meeting, we do a mood check-in, something that simple, where we meet everyone where they're at, right? If someone's at not feeling well, that we're all aware of that, and that we accommodate how this person is feeling, at how we move forward. When there are stressful times within an organization, schools deal with testing, right? and things like that. How are you showing up for each other to listen and to be warm and caring towards one another throughout this stressful time, as opposed to having this kind of suck it up mentality and drive on, which I'm very familiar with, being a US Army veteran, but I don't think it's the kind of organizational practice that you should use when you're trying to cultivate young minds.
A quick request, and it could be that I'm managing the screen, but I can't see everybody, and I'm wondering if that's just me, or yeah, that's what I was asking. Yeah, and I actually have I don't know if this will be a comment or a question, and Pat actually comes to mind with his experience at the governance level, and it seems to me that, and this is really connecting to where Brian's coming from too, is I think a number of people who are teaching in the classroom, they are drawn to that, and very naturally are drawn to this idea of how do we nurture character in our students, with compassion being fundamental. But when it comes time to a full institutional embrace of this, I'm wondering if you're doing any work at a leadership level, and not just within the institution itself, but even at the governance level, whether that would be a board of trustees or or whatever level it might be, even in industry, those that are looking over corporate culture, school culture, because my guess is that if you don't make room for this in schools, if algebra, then you're never going to get there. In business, if there's only a single bottom line, profit, versus, if you will, compassion for stakeholders, then we'll never get there. So I'm wondering if you're
in corporate institutions. Sara and I have done this with hospital systems. I haven't done anything with higher levels of the education system, but we do agree that this is something that needs to be practiced throughout every level of an organization. So with one workshop that we led with a hospital here in Chicago, they had we requested a slice of the organization. So people who clean medical tools, along with leadership, director level leadership, to come join this workshop together. Because while talking about compassion and self-compassion and these kind of personal skills, we also led a design thinking workshop to really figure out how to make it actionable. And if you're talking about a culture of an organization, you really need people at every rung to come together to design what this would look like at the institution. So, and it's not just top down too, right? Some conversation need to come from the bottom up as well. So really getting a lot of buy-in from every piece of organizations is extremely important for promoting this as a value within any institution. Do you have something to add, Sara?
I'd like to follow.
No, I would just say if anyone has any contacts, we would be thrilled to have this discussion with people who are way up there, because we do see how we do believe that this is vitally important. Go ahead, Maureen.
Oh, I'd like to follow up on that. I can speak. I'm in an independent school, and we 2 years ago became a ruler school, which is affiliated with the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which talks about you have to be able to recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate emotion. And we went we went with that program 2 years ago specifically for these very reasons about how are you cultivating empathy and compassion. And in order to do that, you have to have emotional intelligence. And I really appreciated in your slides how you talked about the ability to recognize and label, and the importance of presence, the importance of mindfulness in being able to do that. And this was something that our board of trustees, I'm on the senior leadership team, I do work with our board. And we've built a practice around that. Every meetings we are using our mood meter and we're talking about our emotions. But one of the things that we've also been, rightfully called out on and are working now is the different lived experiences of members of our community, particularly around race. And we're a predominantly white institution, like many of our private and public educational institutions. We've had a Black at Hewitt, and really, and so I'm wondering if you could comment on the importance of the work of cultural responsiveness and anti-racist practices as part of this kind of institutional work, because we're finding that unless we can have compassion, which involves action, to your point, we're not going to actually be able to change our institutions to be ones that are not inflicting suffering and harm.
Burrell.
Sara? Oh, okay, Kat.
This is a tough one. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that's very important. One thing that we talk about at Compassionate is how our brain categorizes people, who we show compassion for and who we don't show compassion for. It's something that is automatic. So we can look at innate biological origins of how we categorize people as threats and non-threats. But when we look at historical injustices and how they might present themselves to the present, you kind of have to cultivate your ability to show compassion for more and more people, because to be generous, sometimes it's no fault of your own that you may have an understanding, a worldview that is not very compassionate, that you inherited from people who may have acted maliciously at some point towards other members of our society. But that means that when you're presented with information that might conflict with what you believe to be the truth of the world around you, you have to have an open heart to accept this new information, to accept your role and responsibility within this new information, but to have compassion for yourself. If you can understand that, like, oh, maybe I learned something wrong at some point, and we all, right, have learned something that may be incorrect. I just recently learned that rats and mice are two different things, right? So when presented with that information, I'm able to grow and say, okay, I need to reject that old information and accept some new information. But it should be rooted in compassion. It should be rooted in reducing suffering. It shouldn't be some kind of performative measure that you do just so that you can check off a box and say, people will look at me and say, I did, X, Y, Z. It's really about alleviating suffering and what am I doing to alleviate suffering. But another reason why I think compassion is something that is extremely important, particularly when we're talking about anti-racism and social justice, is that a compassionate person really lives to support and help the people around them. Any other mission that you might have is subjugated to that primary goal, right? When I wear this wristband every day, I go out with the intent of showing compassion to people. And that's something that's important. And when you're talking about compassion, you need to embody compassion first. That's what makes it so annoying when you're trying to fight on the good side, if you will, is that you actually have to practice what you preach, because people will respond to that. You don't want to be viewed as a hypocrite. And once you're viewed as a hypocrite, your message is completely lost. Now, if you want to spread lies and misinformation and be, a bad person, you don't have to be who you say you are. You can be as fake as you want to be, because no one can hold you accountable for that. But when you're practicing compassion and you're talking about, you know, these different values, you actually have to do it, and you might get called out on it if you're not practicing it appropriately, and that can sometimes make people afraid to embody it. But particularly in education institutions, if teachers, if people, administrators are practicing compassion, when they're interacting with students who may have certain kinds of challenges, you're gonna look at it from a different lens, because everybody, to a compassionate person, every human is a human. There's no good people and bad people. There's just a bunch of people, and we're all one of them. And when we practice that, particularly if we're interacting with minorities and different challenges that different people in communities face, then we're gonna treat certain kinds of issues differently, because we recognize suffering for suffering. I'll tell this story. I was leading a compassion training in the Cook County Jail. And I asked a question that I've asked with working with elementary students, high school students, just different populations all over. What is compassion? And you usually get answers like kindness and, you know, taking care of one another, right? Showing each other care and concern, like all these different kinds of things. But when I asked this in the jail, there was silence. And people were kind of trying to figure out, what is this guy talking about? And they kind of latched on a little bit to passion. So they're like really putting your heart into something. And from that experience, I realized something. I had an awful realization, is that people who have probably never experienced compassion, right? Probably never received compassion from institutions that they've interacted with, from the home to the school to our society writ large. This is what we do to them. This is what we do to people who don't know what compassion means. We throw them into cages. That's our society. That's the world that we live in, and it's unconscionable. But the reason why it exists this way and is so resilient of an institution is because people don't question themselves in their own role in it, because that causes suffering. That's why it's so important to practice compassion, because your relationship with suffering is different. Is that if I'm a part of it, I can acknowledge that I'm a part of it and figure out what it is in my own one person, one singular person within this mess of a system. What is my role in not promoting it and actively fighting against it? And it's not easy, it's hard, but it starts with compassion. It starts with genuinely caring for other human beings. It was I don't know if I answered your question or not. I hope
That was
so.
great, Burrell.
Very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Burrell and I have talked a lot. I'm just going to add to that. Sorry, and then I'll Cambry. I just wanted to say that we talk a lot. We spend a lot of time just talking about compassion, and one thing that we talk a lot about is that compassionate people also don't get angry at individuals, right? We don't hate. We have compassion for everyone, but what we do is we look at the system that they're a part of, and we say, okay, these people came out of a system, and that's why they're acting this way, right? So I can be angry at the system, but I'm not going to be angry at the human being. I'm going to have compassion for them, not condoning any kind of behavior that's harming, but saying that that person deserves compassion because they are products of systems that created who they are. Okay, thank you. Cambry.
Yeah, I really appreciate this, and this maybe builds on the conversation. It's certainly resonating with me, the importance of compassion, not just being interpersonal, but institutional. It's a pretty expansive lens. And building on Maureen and Burrell, your Maureen's question and Burrell's lens, you know, the importance of acknowledging the difficulty of sometimes acknowledging one's own role, not just witnessing, right? Witnessing suffering, and sometimes actually creating or contributing to creating the suffering in of itself. And I think it's hard. It's very hard, right? I mean, there's this ideal of information being presented to you, but there's also that information is not presented to you. How do you see your own potential role in contributing suffering is a really tricky and difficult kind of question. My question is essentially this. So, you know, if we understand that, you know, we can witness suffering, we can receive suffering, we can contribute and create suffering. And all of those can be met with compassion. And we recognize that that's what could happen on an interpersonal level when we are thinking about institutions, right? We're thinking about institutions that are generating and creating potential suffering. What type of institutional or what guidance, tools, or frameworks can one think about when selecting or encouraging institutional action? So not interpersonal responses, but institutional actions that generate and contribute to compassion.
Yeah, you know, depending on your institution and its role to suffering, it really depends. I wish there was a step-by-step guide to becoming a compassionate institution that we could give you, but it's something that needs to be developed. It's something that needs to be explored. One thing that I point out is that it's really important for within an institution is to understand how your institution deals with suffering within. How do people have conversations within your institution about challenges that they're facing? And what are the mechanisms that you're building in order to make sure that people are in right relationship to each other? That's usually an easy place to start, because when you look at institutions, particularly institutions that might cause a lot of harm in our society, they tend to have a bunch of issues internally around that same thing, and that everybody at every rung of that institution is suffering in some kind of way, and they're not even in good relationship with each other, which brings harm to their constituents or the people that they interact with usually. And that's sometimes something as simple as how are you feeling? Being a lot more proactive about taking care of each other within an institution. Now, because institutions live off of legal documents and legal underpinnings, is looking at your bylaws. What does it say? What are some of the things that you might do as an institution? I'll take one easy example. In a lot of organizations that I've worked for, in order for you to get promoted, you need to have a certain level of educational attainment. This is something that is very common in many institutions, in that you need to have XYZ degree, and that no matter how much experience you may have on the job doing this kind of work, if you haven't gotten it signed off by an institution, then you're unqualified. Changing different things like that, because you see that educational attainment is different across races and classes, right? And that you could be perpetuating something that you may look at it and say that, like, well, this isn't something that excludes certain people, but it is something that excludes certain people, and you kind of have to actively fight to challenge that and figure out whether or not this is a policy that we need or don't need. And examining different things like that in your bylaws. Also, taking an active role in representation. Who's being represented? Whose voices are being heard within an institution? And I would say actively fighting to democratize our institution, because democracy is a more compassionate way of organizing ourselves as people. But democracy is something that we think of at the governance level, right? I vote for my senator or these different things like that. But democracy should live within every institution that you're a part of. In my household, it's a democracy. It's not whatever Burrell says goes. That's unfair. That's not a very compassionate system. But Americans, in particular, spend a third of our lives at the very least in very undemocratic places where everything is flowing one way. Now, I don't want to step on anyone's toes if you're running an institution or an organization, but making sure that you gather feedback from the people that you are leading is a compassionate action. It prevents you from causing more harm. So what are you doing to change the structure of your organization to ensure that there's feedback mechanisms? But like I said, there's an unlimited amount of things that you can do. And I feel uncomfortable myself, at least, in saying that here's step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4 blueprint. Compassion requires you to kind of explore what that looks like for your institution. And, you know, me and all my infinite non-wisdom can't tell you exactly what can be done.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for some of those examples, because one of the things I'm grappling with is how to ensure that the compassion, the bylaw example, I appreciate it, because one of the things I'm struggling with is ensuring that compassion is not necessarily about the person who's acknowledging the suffering as feeling an alleviation or specifically feeling warm. Sometimes it really is centering those who are suffering as a part of the solution, and as being able to provide a really expanding the table, being inclusive, so that even if it doesn't feel warm, it might actually be what is right for the people who are experiencing it. So thanks for the examples.
Yeah, I love your point about democratization, Burrell. I think educational institutions need to take a close look at that. I think individual classrooms are run very democratically sometimes, and others are not. And I think institutionally, from leadership at a school board level, at a board of trustees level, at an independent school, huge range of how democratic those processes are. But when I think about involving our student leaders in a process of school change and being kind of agents of school change, you know, there are a lot of issues on which we want to retain the authority to wag the finger if it's about discipline. And when we do that, we create compliance-based cultures which are not compassionate at all. And so for us to be willing to say, this might be stickier, this might be messier as a result, but if we're truly trying to cultivate compassion, we need to democratize, you know, every aspect of our institution and be willing to take the time to do so. Because otherwise we aren't modeling that compassionate behavior at all. So I thank you for that seed. That's a really good one.
Yeah, and you know what? I'll even go as far as to say, you know, there's a huge efficacy to compassion too. It's something that is actually effective. It like you yield a lot of resources from practicing things like this. So another story, I used to do training as a part of my old job at an organization that teaches civic literacy to young people. And we were stationed in middle school. And if there are any middle school teachers on this call, anyone who interacts with middle schools, thank you so much for your service, because whew, like that was rough. However, we ran this after school program, and I did different activities around training in civic literacy. One thing that I did was a workshop on the difference between sympathy, empathy, and compassion, and really cultivating these skills. Well, our after-school program kind of became a landing place for all of the students that they were having issues with. They were like, we're going to put them in your program. That's not what our program was designed to do. And myself and my co-facilitator, I'm not sure we were 100% qualified to handle those kinds of issues, but we kept going. We made sure that it was a welcoming environment, and that no one had any labels in this space. They called us by our first names, right? We wanted to build that kind of relationship of really being equal. We did different techniques like sitting in circle, so as to get rid of hierarchy in these different kinds of principles. Well, one of the things that they have to do as a part of participating is they do a survey with their peers about what the biggest issues are in the school. And then they scrum together as a council to figure out how do we take action on these different issues. So they picked issues, one of which was bullying. And they went around the school and led upstander workshops, which is anti-bullying, in that being an upstander. So if you see something it's your responsibility to get yourself involved. If you have to consult with an adult, maybe, right? But chances are, if you practice this well, you don't actually have to get an adult involved. You can intervene in these small ways. Well, we had a meeting with the principal. So the group of young people and the principal were together, and one of our students was in the principal's office a lot, but he was in this position where he could share, hey, look, this is what the school needs to do, right? Here's what we did. Here are our accomplishments. And the principal was just taken aback. After the meeting, in which when we have these meetings, we still do the work to kind of eliminate the hierarchy. So they're speaking to the principal as equals. And after the meeting, it was just like, how did you get this young person under control? Like, how do you do that? I have never been in a conversation with this young person that wasn't conflict, that wasn't an issue. And I'm just like, because you never asked him what he wanted to accomplish, right? You never thought to not label this person as a problem. As opposed to seeing that, oh, okay, maybe this young person is seeing something that I'm not seeing, and I need to be in conversation or in some kind of right relationship with this person. And the behavioral issues were actually went down because of our involvement, because of us giving this young person agency. So what does that have to do with compassion? It's democracy and democratic practices. The person who comes into the space has a voice that is valuable to me, right? As an instructor, speaking to an institution and ensuring that you're going to respect every person in our program, and you're not going to pick people apart and say, well, I'm not going to talk to this young person because they're a problem person. No, we're not going to do that, right? We're going to sit as equals as much as possible, and it yielded results. So democratizing things and really giving people the benefit of the doubt yields returns. It actually makes things better. You can actually improve situations because of that.
Burrell, thank you. We have a number of questions that have come from our off-screen panel, but we just don't have the time. We understood that we would run out of time in this format, but a response to that, as far as how we're running the forum, is all of these sessions have been taped, recorded, and we hope that you will continue this dialogue in your where you work with your colleagues, with your friends, and so on, and perhaps you can use the recording of this as a prompt to take our little discussion here, public discourse, to a larger public audience. I think we'll probably have those ready in about a week or so, and we'll make sure that all of you know that. Burrell and Sara, thank you so much. Panelists, thank you. This surely is right at the core of so much of what we're all thinking about, and thank you for taking the time to talk through it. Thanks so much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.